I still can't believe I'm alive to recount this story. Each time I close my eyes, I'm transported back to that cave, flashlight quivering in my grasp, the oppressive weight of the earth pressing down on me. I rarely share this, not because it's untrue, but because it's hard for people to grasp the magnitude of what happened. What began as a bucket list adventure spiraled into a harrowing ordeal that tested our will to survive. 3 of us embarked on that expedition: John, Sarah, and me. The trip had been meticulously planned over months of research into local cave systems and equipment preparation. While none of us were professionals, we had a fair amount of experience, and John's confidence gave us a sense of security. He was the most seasoned, having navigated a dozen caves before. Sarah and I were less experienced, but John's leadership seemed reliable. He had maps, ropes, and an almost reckless enthusiasm that bordered on hubris. The entrance to the cave was unassuming, a jagged aperture hidden behind a curtain of dense vegetation. If you weren't actively searching for it, you'd never spot it. Local folklore spoke of disappearances and misfortune, but we dismissed these as myths, stories crafted to keep adventurous souls at bay. The allure of an unmapped cave, untouched and mysterious, was irresistible. This was our chance to venture into the unknown and make a discovery that few others could claim. By mid-morning, we ventured inside, equipped with headlamps, flashlights, and more gear than we'd likely need. The first chamber was breathtaking, its walls glittering with moisture and mineral deposits. Our voices echoed, a testament to the sheer scale of the space. The cool, damp air carried the faint scent of decay, adding an edge of unease to the beauty. Yet stepping into this subterranean world felt electrifying, like breaching an unknown frontier. It felt as though we were pioneers, daring to explore the Earth's uncharted depths. The initial hours were routine. We navigated through tight passageways, crawled through narrow tunnels, and rappelled down vertical drops. The deeper we went, the more challenging the terrain became. The air grew thin, and the confining walls seemed to press closer with every step. Still, we pushed forward, motivated by our shared goal: reaching the cathedral. John had read about this mythical chamber in an old Spelunker's forum. Few had seen it, and there were no detailed maps, only vague, tantalizing descriptions of its vastness and eerie beauty. We paused in a small chamber for a quick break, eating and hydrating while exchanging nervous banter. Sarah joked about how her boyfriend would panic if he knew how deep we were. John, ever the daredevil, grinned. "The deeper you go, the better it gets," he said. His words, intended to be lighthearted, left an uneasy knot in my stomach. It was the first flicker of doubt, though I couldn't pinpoint why. I chalked it up to nerves, but the feeling lingered. As we pressed on, the passages became tighter and more convoluted. At one point, we had to crawl on our stomachs, inching forward through a suffocatingly narrow tunnel. My chest tightened as I dragged myself along, the weight of the rock above an ever-present reminder of our precarious position. But fear was part of the thrill. It sharpened the senses and heightened the stakes. For us, it was as much a test of nerve as it was a journey. Then we encountered the drop. This feature wasn't on John's rudimentary maps, nor was it mentioned in the forum. A vertical shaft plummeted into utter darkness, the bottom invisible even with our most powerful flashlights. John, undeterred, decided we'd rappel down. Sarah voiced concerns about the risks, suggesting we reconsider. But John's determination won out. "We've come too far to stop now," he argued. Reluctantly, we followed. John descended first, vanishing into the abyss. I followed, heart hammering with each inch of rope released. The darkness was oppressive, a tangible force that seemed to wrap around me. At last, my feet touched solid ground. John's flashlight pierced the gloom, and moments later, Sarah joined us, visibly shaken but resolute. The chamber we entered was surreal. Mineral-studded walls sparkled faintly, and bizarre rock formations jutted from the ground like alien sculptures. It was hauntingly beautiful, yet unnervingly foreign. John was enthralled, snapping photos and exploring every crevice. Sarah and I hung back, our growing unease unspoken but palpable. The silence in the chamber was unnerving, broken only by the occasional drip of water or the faint rustle of our movements. A low rumble shattered the silence. The ground quaked beneath us, and a rush of air swept through the chamber. My immediate thought was an earthquake, but the tremor felt strangely localized. Then came the sound, a deep, resonant groan that echoed endlessly. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard, more animalistic than geological. The hair on my neck stood on end. John dismissed it as the cave settling. Sarah and I exchanged worried glances but hesitated to push back. Against our instincts, we followed John deeper into the labyrinth, chasing the elusive cathedral. It felt like the cave was drawing us in, luring us farther from the surface with its hidden wonders and unspoken dangers. The air grew staler, and the silence between tremors felt suffocating. The once thrilling exploration now felt like an intrusion. I began marking walls with chalk, a precaution we hadn't considered necessary until now. It felt as though the cave were conspiring against us, its passages narrowing, its walls pressing closer, its silence bearing down. Every step forward felt heavier, as if we were being watched by something unseen. We stumbled into another chamber, smaller and infinitely more unsettling. Strange carvings covered the walls, spirals and jagged lines etched with a frenzied precision. The markings seemed to writhe under our lights, their chaotic forms defying logic. John was mesmerized. "This is incredible," he whispered, tracing a finger over the carvings. "Who could have made these?" The rumbling returned, louder and closer. The ground heaved violently, and chunks of rock rained from above. Panic overtook us. The groaning sound intensified, reverberating as if the cave itself were roaring in fury. It felt malevolent, as though we'd trespassed on forbidden ground. "We need to leave," Sarah said, her voice trembling. This time, even John didn't argue. But when we turned back, we found our path blocked by a fresh collapse. The way out had vanished. The realization hit like a physical blow. We were trapped. Frantic, we searched for another exit, but the cave was an unrelenting maze. The air grew thinner, our headlamps dimmer. The darkness pressed in, and the groaning sound seemed to emanate from every direction. Time warped. Minutes felt like hours. Fear gnawed at our resolve, and desperation set in. Every moment was a fight to stay calm, to suppress the rising panic that threatened to consume us. Finally, we stumbled upon a narrow, upward passage. It was our only hope. We climbed, scraping our hands and knees on jagged rock, our breaths ragged and shallow. The passage was claustrophobic, but we pressed on, driven by sheer survival instinct. As we ascended, the groaning faded, replaced by an almost sacred silence. It felt as though we were clawing our way back to life. We emerged into the open air just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world in hues of gold and crimson. Collapsing onto the ground, we gasped for breath, too drained to speak. The weight of the ordeal hung heavy, an unspoken acknowledgement of how close we'd come to disaster. To this day, I can't explain what we encountered. Perhaps it was simply the earth shifting, groaning under its own immense weight. Or maybe it was something beyond our understanding, a force not meant to be disturbed. All I know is that I'll never step foot in a cave again. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. They say untouched places in nature can be beautiful, but nature doesn't care about you. It doesn't care about how prepared you are or how much you've planned. I found that out the hard way, on an expedition to map a newly discovered cave in the Nevada desert. It was supposed to be a routine job, but things went wrong in ways I'll never forget. There were 4 of us: me, Dr. Shaw, who was the lead geologist, Andy, an experienced climber, and Megan, a wildlife biologist. Our job was to map the cave and document anything interesting, like unique rock formations or signs of wildlife. Locals called the cave Erebus, and it had only been discovered a few months earlier. People said it was massive and untouched, which had Dr. Shaw buzzing with excitement. For me, it was just another job with a paycheck and a bit of adventure. The entrance to the cave was in the middle of a flat, rocky area, surrounded by sand and shrubs. It was a huge, jagged hole in the ground that looked like it had been ripped open by some ancient force. Dr. Shaw couldn't stop talking about how unique it was, already imagining theories about how it formed. His excitement rubbed off on all of us, even Megan, who had been skeptical about the trip at first. We started our descent early in the morning, lowering ourselves into the cave one by one. The first chamber was enormous. The walls sparkled with quartz, and the air was cool and damp, completely different from the heat above ground. Andy set up our ropes and anchors like a pro, while Dr. Shaw took photos and narrated his findings. Megan pointed out small signs of life. A bat's trail here, some insects there. It felt like we were exploring another world. As we went deeper, the cave got more surreal. Stalactites hung from the ceiling like frozen icicles, and the walls seemed to shimmer under the light of our headlamps. Some of the formations looked so precise they seemed hand-carved. "It's like natural art," Dr. Shaw said, grinning as he took more photos. It was beautiful, but there was also something unsettling about it. The deeper we went, the heavier the air felt, and the silence seemed to press in on us. Around midday, we reached what we thought was the bottom chamber. It was massive, like a stone cathedral, with walls that glittered like they were studded with stars. In the center was a pool of water, perfectly still and so clear it looked like glass. Megan took a sample while Andy explored a narrow crack on the far side of the room. "I think this leads to another chamber," he said, shining his flashlight into the gap. Dr. Shaw's eyes lit up. "We have to check it out. If it's unmapped, this could be a huge discovery." The crack was tight, barely wide enough for us to squeeze through. Andy went first, then me, then Megan, with Dr. Shaw bringing up the rear. The passage was so narrow that my backpack scraped against the walls and I had to fight the urge to panic. The air got colder, and our lights seemed dimmer, as though the darkness itself was swallowing them. Finally, the passage opened into another chamber. This one was smaller but stranger. The walls were smooth, almost polished, and covered in spiral-shaped carvings. They looked too perfect to be natural. Megan ran her hand over one, frowning. "These look artificial," she said. "Like someone made them." Dr. Shaw was thrilled. "This could be evidence of ancient human activity," he said, snapping pictures. "Or even proto-human. This is incredible." While Shaw was busy documenting, Andy found another opening in the wall. "There's a drop here," he said. "Looks like it goes straight down. Hard to tell how far." "We should mark this and head back," Megan said. I could tell she was uneasy. "We're pushing our limits and this place gives me the creeps." Dr. Shaw shook his head. "We can't leave without checking. We might not get another chance." Despite feeling uneasy, we set up ropes and prepared to descend. Andy went first, disappearing into the darkness below. "It's stable," he called after a moment. "And it opens up. You need to see this." One by one, we followed. The drop was longer than we'd expected, the shaft narrowing before opening into another chamber. This one was gigantic, even bigger than the first. The spiral carvings covered every surface, more intricate and detailed than before. The air was icy cold and smelled faintly metallic. In the center of the room was another pool, but this one was filled with a dark, thick liquid that seemed to absorb light. "What is that?" Megan asked, shining her flashlight over it. The light barely penetrated the surface, but the liquid rippled faintly, as though alive. Dr. Shaw crouched at the edge of the pool, reaching out with a gloved hand to take a sample. As soon as his fingers touched the liquid, it reacted violently, bubbling and recoiling. He stumbled back, his glove smoking. "It's corrosive," he said, his voice shaking, highly reactive. Andy backed away. "We need to get out of here," he said, fear clear in his voice. Before we could move, the ground started to shake. It was subtle at first, then grew into a violent tremor. The spirals on the walls seemed to shimmer, and a low humming noise filled the chamber. The liquid in the pool began to bubble and emit a sharp, acrid smell that burned our eyes and throats. "Go!" Megan shouted, grabbing Dr. Shaw and pulling him toward the ropes. Andy and I scrambled after them, rushing to climb out. The walls seemed to close in as the humming grew louder, vibrating through the stone. It felt like the cave was collapsing around us. When we finally reached the upper chamber, the shaking had stopped, but the silence was worse. No one spoke as we navigated back through the narrow passage, each of us lost in our thoughts. The cave felt different now, like it was alive and watching us. We emerged into the desert just as the sun was setting. The relief of fresh air and open space was overwhelming. Dr. Shaw looked at his glove, the fingertips eaten away by the liquid. "We'll need to analyze this," he said quietly. As we packed up, Megan sat on the ground, staring back at the darkened cave. Her expression was distant, haunted. "I told you, whatever's down there, it's not meant to be disturbed." None of us argued. Even Shaw, usually the one to push boundaries, stayed silent. We left quickly, each step away from the cave feeling like a reprieve. But even as the truck rumbled over the rocky terrain, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd narrowly escaped something worse than we could imagine. Erebus wasn't just a cave. It was a warning, carved in spirals and shadows, begging us to stay away. And this time, I intend to listen. I've always been drawn to caving. There's something exciting about going into the unknown, exploring tight spaces where most people wouldn't dare to go. It's quiet, peaceful, and challenging. Or at least, that's what I used to think. After what happened, I'm never stepping foot in a cave again. This story isn't about an extreme or dangerous expedition. It was supposed to be simple. A solo trip to explore a small, uncharted cave system in the mountains. A fellow caver had told me about it. He said it wasn't a big cave, just tight spaces and narrow tunnels, perfect for crawling. That sounded like exactly my kind of adventure. I packed light for the trip. A helmet, headlamp, backup flashlight, knee pads, gloves, water, and a snack. It was enough for a day underground. I made sure to tell a friend where I was going and when I'd be back. Safety is always the priority when caving, or so I thought. I was confident I had everything under control. The entrance to the cave was hard to spot. It was hidden behind some bushes on the side of a hill. I moved them aside and found a small, jagged opening in the rock. It was exactly what I'd hoped for, untouched and waiting to be explored. I squeezed in, feeling the cool air from inside brush against my face. The first chamber wasn't much. A small, dome-shaped room just big enough to sit up in. The walls sparkled with minerals, and the air smelled damp. It was calm and quiet, the kind of place I loved. As I went deeper, the tunnels began to narrow. That's pretty normal when caving, and it didn't bother me. The tighter the spaces, the better the challenge. At one point, I had to turn sideways to slip through a crack. The rough rock scraped against my shoulders as I wriggled through. My headlamp lit up the tunnel ahead, showing nothing but smooth, untouched stone. About an hour in, I came to a crawl space. It wasn't the first one I'd seen, and it didn't look too bad. The tunnel stretched ahead, barely tall enough for me to crawl on my stomach. I took a sip of water, adjusted my helmet, and started forward. The first few feet were easy. The rock was smooth, and the air was cool against my face. My headlamp lit up the path ahead, and I could see the tunnel dipping slightly downward. I focused on my breathing, slow and steady. Crawling through tight spaces can feel claustrophobic, but staying calm is key. As long as you trust yourself, you'll be fine. At least, that's what I thought. I'd made it about halfway through the crawl space when I heard it. At first, it was faint, just a sound that blended into the background. It was so quiet I almost ignored it. But then I realized it was a whisper, just one word. I couldn't make out what it said, but it was enough to make me stop. My breath caught in my throat. Caves can play tricks on your ears. The way sound bounces off the walls can make it seem like it's coming from everywhere at once. I told myself it was just the echo of my own movement. That had to be it. But then I heard it again. This time it was louder. It was clearer. Someone was whispering, and I heard the word, "Stop." My stomach tightened. I froze, my body pressed against the rock. My first instinct was to turn around, but the tunnel was too tight. I couldn't twist my body or even look back. If I wanted to turn around, I'd have to back out completely, and that would take time. My headlamp's beam lit up the rock in front of me, but behind me, there was only darkness. "Hello?" I called out. My voice sounded small and shaky, muffled by the tight space. "Is someone there?" Nothing, just silence. I held my breath, listening for any sound, but all I could hear was the faint drip of water somewhere in the cave. Maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe the whisper was just my mind playing tricks on me. Tight spaces can mess with your head if you're not careful. I forced myself to take a deep breath and move forward. I couldn't let fear stop me. The tunnel got even tighter, pressing against my sides. My helmet scraped against the ceiling as I crawled forward inch by inch. I focused on the light ahead, telling myself there was nothing behind me. But then I heard it again. "Don't." This time, it was closer. The voice wasn't faint or muffled. It was clear, and it was right behind me. My heart pounded as panic set in. Someone was back there. I couldn't move fast, couldn't turn around. The tunnel was too small. I felt trapped. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice breaking. "This isn't funny." No response, just silence and the sound of my own breathing. I waited, straining to hear anything, but there was nothing. My chest felt tight, and I realized I needed to move. Staying still wasn't an option. I pulled myself forward, my arms shaking. The tunnel seemed endless, the light from my headlamp barely reaching more than a few feet ahead. Then I felt it, a light touch on my ankle, so faint it could have been my imagination. But it wasn't. I kicked back instinctively, my foot hitting nothing but empty air. "Get away from me!" I screamed. My voice echoed through the tunnel, distorted and alien. Panic took over. I scrambled forward as fast as I could, the rock scraping against my sides and shoulders. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst. My muscles burned, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. Finally, I saw it, the faint glow of an open chamber ahead. I lunged forward, ignoring the pain as my body scraped against the rock. I pulled myself out of the crawl space and into the chamber, collapsing onto the floor. My headlamp swung wildly as I turned to look behind me. The crawl space was empty. I sat there, gasping for air, my hands shaking. There was nothing in the tunnel, no one. But I knew what I'd heard, what I'd felt. I wasn't alone. I didn't wait. I grabbed my gear and started making my way back to the surface. My legs were trembling, and every sound made me jump. The silence of the cave was no longer peaceful. It was oppressive, suffocating. Shadows seemed to move, and every drip of water sounded like a footstep. When I finally climbed out into the sunlight, I collapsed onto the ground. The warmth of the sun on my face felt like a blessing. I didn't look back at the cave. I couldn't. Whatever was down there could stay there. The trip back to my car felt like the longest walk of my life. Every snap of a twig or crunch of gravel made me jump, my heart racing. When I finally reached the vehicle, I threw my gear inside and sat in the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel tightly. My hands were still trembling, my mind replaying the events over and over. I haven't gone caving since. I've tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, that the whispers and the touch weren't real. Maybe it was the acoustics of the cave or the isolation messing with my senses. But deep down, I know the truth. I wasn't alone in that cave, and I never want to find out who or what was behind me.